So, is there some kind of list of strange rules I have to follow? I asked, mostly joking. I tend to have a smart mouth, and sometimes I can't help myself. Stanley just shook his head. Only one rule, kid, he said. Don't die. He wasn't messing around. Before I could say anything else, he handed me a heavy-duty 3-cell maglite and gave me a nod. Good luck, he added, then turned away, pulling the security gate down over the entrance to the abandoned hospital. The loud clang echoed through the empty street as he locked it up tight. He hesitated for a moment, then looked back at me. Listen, he said, lowering his voice slightly. It's not exactly a rule, but it's solid advice. Stick to the upper floors if you can. The ceilings are lower up there, and the hallways are narrower. Gives you a bit of an advantage. I frowned. Advantage against what? Stanley didn't answer. He was already making his way down the cracked concrete steps, his limp more pronounced in the dim glow of the streetlight. He reached the curb, where a company truck sat idling, exhaust curling into the cold night air. He called back to me over his shoulder. You'll be fine. I've got a good feeling about you. Then he was gone. I never wanted this job. Truth be told, I never really wanted any job. My dad always said I was shiftless, unmotivated, lacking ambition. He never said it to my face, but he never exactly checked to see if I was within earshot either. Mom had a different take. She was convinced I just hadn't found the right spirit guide to illuminate my life path. She's big into that new age stuff. Crystals, chakras, meditation retreats, the whole thing. And my girlfriend? Well, I guess I should say ex-girlfriend, since she's been ghosting me for 5 days now. She thought I was depressed. Maybe she was right. I used to work in the mailroom at an investment firm downtown. It was just a job to me, nothing more. I didn't care about stocks or the market, and I sure as hell didn't care about climbing the corporate ladder. While my coworkers were busy schmoozing with the higher-ups, networking, building relationships, and looking for ways to get ahead, I was just there. I'd drop envelopes on people's desks, maybe throw in a half-hearted nod or a tight-lipped smile if I was feeling particularly social that day. Then the pandemic hit, and I got laid off. My roommates took it in stride. Anita picked up gig work delivering food and taught herself guitar through YouTube. Sanjay started working from home, even put on real pants for his Zoom meetings. Me, I spent most of my time lying in bed, scrolling aimlessly through my phone, listening to creepypasta narrations on YouTube. That's actually where I got the idea for the weird rules joke. Though clearly, Stanley wasn't the type to get the reference. Some days, when I felt a tiny spark of motivation, I'd play a few levels of Candy Crush. Most days, though, I did nothing. I didn't change clothes, didn't eat unless my stomach made a point of reminding me. I rarely even checked the calendar. If it weren't for my phone's lock screen, I wouldn't have known what month it was, let alone what day of the week. I didn't want anything. I didn't care about anything. I barely existed. Every now and then I'd press my fingers to my neck just to make sure I still had a pulse. The only way things could have gotten worse was if I had to move back in with my parents. That became a real possibility once the world started opening back up and my unemployment checks ran dry. My old job never called me back. I got a text from HR saying they were downsizing the mailroom. I barely even reacted. But my roommates? They took the news a little harder. The first time I couldn't come up with my share of the rent, Anita and Sanjay sat me down and gave it to me straight. Either I found a job and started paying my way, or I had to move out. I thought about joking that I was just waiting for my scratch-off tickets to hit big, but I knew better. They weren't in the mood. So, yeah, I finally got off my ass. Craigslist seemed like the easiest place to start. That's where I found the job listing. Overnight security. No experience necessary. Immediate opening. Sounded perfect. Low effort. No customer service. No annoying coworkers. Just me, getting paid to sit in a booth and scroll through my phone all night. I called the number in the ad. A guy picked up immediately and told me to come in for an interview right away. I showered for the first time in longer than I want to admit. Dug around for some pants that weren't completely disgusting. They even sent an Uber to pick me up. The company office was a small storefront, the kind that still had one of those old-fashioned signs painted on the inside of the glass. The lettering was faded and chipped, but at least it wasn't written in Sharpie on a piece of cardboard, so I figured that was a good sign. Inside, I was met by a guy in his 50s with thinning hair and the beginnings of a serious gut. He introduced himself as Stanley. He had a noticeable limp as he led me back to his office, gesturing for me to sit. The interview was not what I expected. He didn't care where I went to school, didn't ask about my work history, didn't even pretend to be interested in my qualifications. Instead, he focused on my personal life. Was I close to my family? Not really. Did I have a lot of friends? No. Was I dating anyone? It's complicated. Probably not. His line of questioning threw me a little, but I rolled with it. Then he hit me with something unexpected. What's your size? I blinked. 5'5", 130 pounds. His face lit up. He clapped his hands together. Perfect. Okay, that was weird. Then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. Last question, he said. Are you a good runner? I hesitated. Runner? You know? He pumped his arms at his sides like a jogger. Fast? Got stamina? I shrugged. I ran cross-country in high school, but that was like 5 years ago. Stanley grinned. That'll do. He grabbed a Post-it note, scribbled down an address, and slid it across the desk to me. Meet me here, he said. No later than 10:45 tonight. Aren't we going to talk about pay, benefits, and all that? I asked, figuring those were pretty important details to iron out before agreeing to spend the night in a creepy, abandoned hospital. Stanley just grinned like he knew something I didn't. Let's see how you feel about the job in the morning. If you still want it, we'll discuss the details then. And just like that, he walked me to the door, still smiling like I was some kind of inside joke. He gave my hand a firm shake. I got a good feeling about you, kid, he said, voice full of confidence. Now, I know exactly what you're thinking. You're thinking I was about to end up as the unwilling participant in some deranged rich guy's twisted game. Maybe a manhunt where the grand prize was my severed head. Yeah. I thought the same thing. At 10:25, my Uber pulled up. I stood there for a good 10 seconds, debating whether I should actually go through with this. But then I thought about packing up my stuff and crawling back into my parents' basement, where my dad would barely look at me and my mom would try to cleanse my aura every time I sat down. So, I got in the car. Besides, even if Stanley was a lunatic with a fetish for chasing short guys, I figured I had a decent chance of outrunning him. Fear is one hell of a motivator, and I was pretty sure that even 5 years past my last cross-country meet, I could still sprint faster than whatever the hell his plan involved. 15 minutes later, the car slowed to a stop in front of St. Luke's Memorial Hospital. If this place had any urban legends tied to it, I'd never heard them. Hell, I didn't even know the hospital existed before I showed up. But looking at it now, I couldn't understand why. This was the kind of building you'd expect to be haunted as hell. It sat back from the road at the end of a semicircular driveway, nestled between old walk-ups and a few scattered storefronts. A place like this should have had a reputation. Whispers, stories, something. Instead, it was just there, like it had been scrubbed from people's memories. Stanley's pickup truck was idling near the steps. He waved me over, barely waiting for me to shut the car door before motioning me forward. The hospital itself was 5 stories tall, its wings stretching out on either side of the main entrance. The architecture was brutal, functional, and lifeless. Poured concrete, dull yellow brick accents around the windows, and a flat roof that loomed over everything. It reminded me of those old high schools from the 70s, the kind you see in your parents' yearbooks where everyone looks vaguely miserable. Every window was covered by thick, ornamental iron bars. The ground floor was hidden behind a towering brick wall, also topped with iron spikes. The whole thing looked less like a hospital and more like a prison for ghosts. So what exactly am I supposed to be doing here? I asked as we made our way up the steps. Simple, Stanley said. You stay inside and keep an eye on things until 7 in the morning. The water's still on in the main building if you need a drink or the bathroom, but there's no power. I frowned. Okay, but what if someone tries to break in? Call the cops, I snorted. Right, and let me guess, there's no Wi-Fi either. Your phone won't work inside, he said, completely ignoring my sarcasm. Too much rebar in the concrete blocks the signal. That raised about 10 different red flags, but before I could question it, he added, not that it matters. No one ever tries to break in. Just get through the night and I'll be back at 7. Then he was gone, leaving me alone in front of the massive, silent hospital. I should have been more concerned about the ridiculous number of warning signs slapping me in the face. Instead, I was just annoyed I wouldn't be able to watch YouTube. That's when I decided to lean into my usual smartass tendencies and ask about weird rules. And now, here I was. The first couple of hours were boring as hell. I wandered the halls, waving my flashlight over dusty exam tables, empty offices, and abandoned nurses' stations. The hospital was a dull, lifeless maze of beige walls and grimy linoleum floors. Even before years of dust settled over everything, this place must have looked depressing. Honestly, if my life could be translated into architecture, it would probably look exactly like this. A hallway beside the reception desk led deeper into the building. Past the long-dead elevators and central staircase, I found what used to be a cafeteria, a kitchen, a couple of administrative offices, and a waiting room. Most of the furniture and equipment had been cleared out, but there were still a few remnants of the past. Empty desks, filing cabinets, a few stray office chairs that probably hadn't been sat in for decades. In the waiting room, I found something weird, a bunch of tall, upside-down aluminum cones scattered near the walls. At first, I had no idea what they were. Then I looked closer and saw they were filled with sand and cigarette butts, ashtrays, which meant this hospital must have closed before I was even born, because I sure as hell couldn't remember a time when people could smoke inside a hospital. That was when I realized just how old this place really was. And for the first time that night, something about this job didn't just seem weird. It seemed wrong. The wings flanking the main building had long corridors with emergency stairwells positioned at both ends. Lining these halls were doors, likely leading to offices that once belonged to the doctors who had worked here. Most of the doors stood ajar, allowing the dim orange glow from the streetlights outside to filter through the filthy windows. It wasn't much, but it was enough to navigate without my flashlight. Still, I kept it on. There was something odd that I should have picked up on much earlier. The place was pristine, not in the sense of cleanliness, but in the sense that it was untouched. No graffiti scrawled across the walls, no shattered windows, no discarded beer cans, empty liquor bottles, or crumpled cigarette packs littering the floor. No used needles, no broken glass pipes, none of the usual signs that squatters or addicts had ever claimed this place as their own. The only real damage I found was in a couple of rooms where it looked like someone had kicked the doors clean off their hinges. Inside, pieces of broken furniture were scattered about, and deep gouges marred the walls. More red flags. More things I ignored. By the time 2:30 a.m. rolled around, I was actually starting to enjoy myself. For the first time in years, I wasn't glued to my phone, wasn't just coasting through life with my head down. Instead, I was actively engaged with my surroundings, taking in the eerie stillness of the place. There was a faint, buzzing energy in the back of my skull, like a runner's high before a race, or the nervous thrill of a first date. It was ridiculous, really. Calling a long-abandoned hospital fresh or exciting was probably the dumbest thing I'd ever thought, but that's exactly how it felt. And then came the crash. Distant, muffled, but unmistakable. The kind of sound that shouldn't exist in an empty place. It carried easily through the stale, dead air of the corridors, making it impossible to pinpoint the source. My pulse hammered as I turned toward the sound, trying to place it. It had come from below. I remembered seeing a sign back at the main stairwell, an arrow pointing downward with a list of destinations: laundry, storage, boiler, morgue. That last one was why I hadn't ventured down there yet. Exploring an abandoned hospital was one thing. Wandering into a morgue? No thanks. I had almost convinced myself that it was just a pile of junk finally giving in to gravity when more noises followed. Thuds, bangs, scraping sounds. I stood frozen in the north wing, about 20 feet from where the hall intersected with the main building. Past the lobby, past the reception desk, just around the corner from the central stairs and, unfortunately, the basement access. That's where the noises were coming from. A chill ran down my spine as I swallowed the dryness in my throat. "Stanley, that you?" The words left my mouth weak and brittle, barely more than a whisper. My flashlight trembled in my grip, the beam flickering as my pulse pounded behind my ears. Then came a noise that didn't belong, a wet, rasping breath. And something moved. At the very edge of my flashlight's reach, just past the reception desk, a cluster of long, spindly fingers curled around the hallway corner. They were impossibly thin, each one jointed like the segmented legs of some grotesque, oversized spider. I barely had time to register them before the rest of it emerged. Slowly, a head slid into view, far too high above the ground, so close to the ceiling it nearly scraped against the tiles. The skin was withered, the color of rotting leather, stretched thin over a skull that seemed too long, too angular. Straggly black hair, tangled and filthy, hung from its scalp in limp strands, like something decaying in swamp water. Then I saw its eyes. Twin pits of reflective silver, like coins resting at the bottom of a stagnant well. It stared at me, and then it smiled. Its lips peeled back, revealing rows upon rows of jagged, serrated teeth. My stomach lurched, my breath hitched. Then, in a single moment of clarity, I screamed. Not a heroic scream, not a battle cry, just pure animal terror. I remember that part vividly. It's strange, the details that stick with you when you're about to die. Then I ran. No plan, no direction, just blind, desperate flight. I didn't look back because I knew it would be following. Because that's what monsters do. They chase you, they hunt you down, and then they kill you, usually in the most agonizing way imaginable. I could hear it, sharp, rapid clicks against the linoleum tiles behind me. Talons? Claws? Some kind of monstrous appendage scraping the floor as it chased me down. The sound was growing louder, closer, but I didn't dare turn my head. At the end of the hall, I spotted a door and slammed through it, my shoulders screaming in protest. I stumbled into the emergency stairwell, my breath ragged. There was no time to think, no time to hesitate. Up. That was my only option. My feet pounded against the steps as I took them two at a time, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever nightmare had just crawled out of the dark. By the time I reached the first landing, marked with a sign that read surgery, the creature crashed through the door below, its impact rattling the walls. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I threw myself into the second-floor corridor, my heart hammering against my ribs, barely managing to dodge the scattered wheelchairs and abandoned gurneys left behind like forgotten relics of a bygone era. Halfway down the hallway, I spotted a nurse's station, an island of rotting plywood and peeling formica in the middle of the abandoned hospital. Without thinking, I dove behind the counter, curling into the smallest shape I could, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I flicked off my flashlight just as the thing burst through the stairwell door with terrifying force. The sound of its pursuit slowed. The rapid clicking of claws on tile became a deliberate, measured pace, like a predator savoring the hunt. Through the grimy windows, the dim glow of streetlights filtered in, casting warped shadows on the cabinets and crumbling corkboards behind the nurse's station. Then, it stopped. It was right there, just on the other side of the counter. Only a thin, brittle sheet of wood separated me from whatever was hunting me. Spindly, elongated fingers curled around the edge of the counter, their spiked tips tapping lightly against the underside. Tap, tap, tap. Each delicate movement sent a cold wave of terror through my veins. They were so close, mere inches from my face. My skin tingled, my entire body frozen in place. I pressed a shaking hand over my mouth, terrified that the sound bubbling up from my throat would escape. A sob? A scream? Or, God help me, a laugh? I didn't even know what was about to break free. My mind was unraveling, my body locked between sheer terror and the absurd, gut-wrenching instinct to giggle like a lunatic. Before I lost control, the creature exhaled a sharp, rattling breath and began moving again. I waited, forced myself to stay still as its footsteps receded, each click of its claws growing fainter. After what felt like an eternity, I dared to peek around the counter. It had moved down the hall, well, nearly at the junction where the wing met the main building. Now that I could see it fully, my stomach twisted. It was vaguely human, just enough to be unsettling, but so thin, so gaunt that its bones pressed against its leathery skin like jagged branches under a tarp. And its height? It was enormous. Easily 10, maybe even 12 feet tall. I watched in sick fascination as it moved, its grotesquely elongated body forced into an awkward shuffle to fit through the corridor, bent almost double beneath the low ceiling. Suddenly, Stanley's warning made sense. Stick to the upper floors. If this thing had been able to run, really run, I wouldn't have even made it 2 steps before it caught me. I had to get out of here. Now. Moving as silently as I could, I started to slip out from behind the counter. My fingers clenched around the mag light in my hand, its cold metal a small comfort. I turned to make my escape. Clunk! The flashlight bumped against the wall. It wasn't loud, just a soft, hollow noise. But in the deathly silence of the hospital, it might as well have been a gunshot. The creature whipped around. It spotted me. And then it shrieked. The sound was piercing, unnatural, like the wail of something that had never belonged in this world. My entire body seized up with terror before my instincts took over. I ran. I sprinted back toward the stairwell. My only chance. My only hope. I lunged up the steps, taking them 2, 3 at a time, ignoring the way my legs burned, ignoring the stabbing pain in my ribs. I had to move. I hit the door to the 3rd floor and nearly tore it off its hinges as I crashed through into the patient ward hallway. There, an open room. I bolted inside without thinking. Empty, except for 2 rusted bed frames and a tattered vinyl privacy curtain swaying between them. 2 windows, both barred. The heavy thud of footsteps pounded up the stairwell behind me. Nowhere to run. No time to block the door. And nothing to defend myself with. My body acted before my mind did. I threw myself behind one of the bed frames, pressing my back against the cold wall. Desperation clawed at my throat as I reached for the curtain, pulling it around me, wrapping myself up like a child hiding beneath the covers from the boogeyman. The second the fabric stopped rustling, the door slammed open. I held my breath. The creature stormed inside, its guttural snarl filled with frustration. It hadn't spotted me. Not yet. It let out a low, rasping growl. Then, crash! It grabbed one of the bed frames and smashed it against the wall, metal screeching as it twisted under the pressure of inhuman strength. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. Then, swish. Its razor-tipped fingers slashed through the privacy curtain just above my head. The fabric ripped free from the rod and collapsed around me, pulling me down with it. I hit the floor, curled in a ball, my entire body trembling. I was exposed now. If it looked down, if it reached out, if it so much as twitched in my direction, but instead, it turned its fury on the other bed frame. Crash. It shattered against the wall, another snarl, a sharp exhale. It was angry, furious that I had slipped through its grasp. I stayed perfectly still. Even when the end cap of one of the broken bedposts snapped off, flew across the room, and struck me in the temple so hard my vision exploded with stars. The creature huffed, releasing a series of sharp, guttural snorts as it lingered in the room for a few agonizing moments. I held my breath, every muscle locked in place, listening as it finally turned and forced its way back out into the hallway. Even then, I didn't move. I stayed sprawled on the floor beneath the crumpled curtain, motionless, barely daring to breathe. My heartbeat pounded so violently in my chest that I was sure the creature would hear it, would sense it, and come right back. I clenched my teeth, inhaling through them in a desperate attempt to suppress the unbearable urge to make a noise. Whether a strangled scream or an uncontrollable, hysteria-fueled giggle, I couldn't even tell. It took everything in me to remain still until I was certain the thing had truly left. For all I knew, it could be lingering just outside the door, crouching low, waiting, listening, preparing to strike the second I let my guard down. But I couldn't just stay there forever. My entire body was buzzing with adrenaline, trembling with the need to move. If I stayed hidden too long, I feared my limbs would betray me, jerking, spasming, doing something that would give away my position. I needed to find a real hiding place, somewhere secure, somewhere I could stay until daylight. Or better yet, I had to get to the roof. If I could get high enough, maybe I'd clear whatever concrete and rebar was blocking my signal, and I could finally call for help. The dim, flickering glow of the streetlights seeped weakly through the dirt-streaked windows, casting just enough illumination across the 3rd floor for me to navigate without stumbling. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. However, the stairwell, the only way up, was nothing but a suffocating void of darkness. There was no avoiding it. I hesitated, fingers twitching over the flashlight in my grip, dreading what might happen the second I turned it on. My mind conjured the image instantly, those dull, silver eyes reflecting back at me from the abyss, locking onto me the moment I dared to shine a light. I swallowed hard, took a breath so deep it burned in my lungs, and forced myself to click the button. The stairwell remained empty. Nothing moved above or below. I exhaled, barely resisting the urge to collapse from sheer relief, then carefully made my way upward. Creeping past the 4th floor, then the 5th. At the top of the stairwell, I finally found the door to the roof. My way out. Chained and padlocked. My stomach dropped. I yanked at the lock, checked my phone again. Still no service. No signal. No way out, no backup plan. I clenched my jaw and turned back toward the stairs, knowing I had no choice but to descend. Then, about 5 steps down from the 5th floor landing, I heard it. A soft scrape. A clawed foot dragging against the concrete. The sound came from below, from the heavy, suffocating darkness that stretched beneath me. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. Slowly, I raised my flashlight and tilted it over the railing. 2 floors down, I saw them. Those silver eyes, fixed on me, unblinking. The creature let out a low, rattling growl, a sound that twisted unnervingly into something almost like laughter, before lunging forward, scrambling up the stairs with terrifying speed. I turned and bolted. In my panic, I misstepped, tripped, caught myself, kept running. I barely made it to the 5th floor hallway, shoving through the door just as the creature reached the landing below. I had no time to think, no time to process. My only focus was forward, away, escape. Even in my desperate sprint, I registered something familiar. This floor, with its padded rooms and strange, outdated equipment. The remnants of an electroshock machine stood in one of the open doorways. The mental ward. A strange thought to linger on while running for my life. I tore down the corridor, heart slamming against my ribs, every footfall echoing as the thing pursued me, its monstrous limbs pounding against the floor. I had intended to make a run for the central stairwell. Maybe descend, maybe find another way out. But even in my terror, I realized that was suicide. If it was gaining on me now, slowed by the narrow hallway, then in the open stairwell, I wouldn't stand a chance. I had to think fast. I had to move faster. The first room I spotted with a sturdy-looking door, I took it. I threw myself inside, turned, and slammed the door behind me with all my strength. My fingers flew to the deadbolt above the knob and twisted it into place just as the creature's footsteps came thundering down the hall. The room was small, walls lined with empty shelves, a janitor's closet, a few push brooms, a mop bucket with a wringer, a laundry cart shoved against the back wall. Useless. Utterly useless. Then, impact. The first slam against the door sent tremors through the tiny room, knocking dust from the frame, rattling the shelves. A second blow followed immediately after, and I swore I heard the wood start to splinter. I had seconds, maybe less. Frantically, I grabbed what I could, shoving the mop bucket, the brooms, the cart, anything, against the door in a pathetic attempt at reinforcement. It wouldn't hold. I knew it wouldn't hold. I tried to rip the shelves down, but they were bolted to the walls. The third impact was worse. The wood cracked. I was out of time. Desperation clawed at me. My flashlight beam flickered wildly across the room as I searched, hunted, prayed for something, anything. Then, I saw it. A small square panel in the back wall. A laundry chute. No hesitation. I lunged for it, yanking the panel open and gripping the edge. The door behind me exploded inward, wood shattering as the force sent the cart and buckets crashing against the opposite wall. I didn't think. I dove, headfirst into the chute. The drop wasn't long, maybe 6 feet, but the moment I stopped, I felt something worse than falling. I was rising. Something was pulling me back up. Panicked, I flicked the flashlight down between my knees. A hand, an arm. The creature had reached into the chute, shoved its limb in up to the shoulder, and its clawed fingers had managed to snag my sneaker. I braced my back and arms against the cold metal walls, straining to push myself free, but the creature's grip was relentless. No matter how much I struggled, I was being dragged upward, my sweaty palms squealing against the slick metal of the chute. Desperation surged through me. I curled my shoulders inward, tucked my chin to my chest, and reached for my shoelace with trembling fingers. Just barely, I managed to grasp it and pull, hard. The knot slipped loose. My foot slid out of the sneaker, and suddenly I was falling. I tried to slow my descent by pressing my hands and feet against the chute walls, but it did little to stop the inevitable. The air rushed past me, my stomach lurched, and then, impact. I slammed into the floor of the laundry room 5 stories below. Pain exploded through my body as everything went black. When I came to, I was sprawled on the far side of a large rectangular room. The harsh scent of detergent and old fabric filled my nostrils. Industrial-sized washers and dryers lined both walls, their steel exteriors reflecting the dim light from the single flickering bulb overhead. My ears rang, my vision swam, but through the pounding in my skull, I heard it. Movement. Soft, deliberate footsteps echoing from the open doorway at the far end of the room. The creature was in the basement, and it was getting closer. I had no time to think. I yanked open the door of one of the front-loading dryers. The drum was big enough for me to squeeze inside, but the glass door would make it useless as a hiding spot. My breath caught in my throat as my gaze darted past the machines. That's when I noticed it. A narrow space behind the dryers, just wide enough for someone to wedge themselves into. I clicked off my flashlight and slid into the cramped space, pressing my body against the cold concrete wall. Seconds later, the creature arrived. The first thing it did was rip open every washer and dryer door, peering inside each one with those gleaming, dull silver eyes. My heartbeat hammered against my ribs as I held my breath, praying it wouldn't think to check behind the machines. But I had a bigger problem. The air was thick with dust and lint, swirling around me in the darkness, teasing the inside of my nose. I clamped my fingers over my nostrils, but it was too late. I felt it building, crawling up the back of my sinuses like a cruel inevitability. A sneeze. I fought it. My lungs burned from holding my breath. My vision blurred. But just as I thought I was about to lose the battle, the creature let out a guttural snarl and stomped away, backhanding the machines in frustration as it went. One of the dryers near me was hit so hard it toppled backward, slamming into the wall with a metallic screech. If I hadn't instinctively ducked, it would have crushed my skull. I stayed frozen, listening to the sound of its retreating footsteps. When I was sure it was gone, I started working my way out of the tight space. It wasn't easy. Some of the machines were still tilted from the creature's rampage, forcing me to crawl on my side to squeeze past them. Dust clung to my clothes, my hair, even the inside of my mouth. By the time I reached the end of the row, I looked like I had been buried in a lint trap. Judging by the fading noise, the creature had left the laundry room and gone off to the right. I went left. Another mistake in a night full of them. The hallway dead-ended at a heavy metal door. Even before I cautiously uncovered my flashlight lens and let a sliver of light slip through my fingers, I knew what the sign would say. Morgue. A cold, sick feeling settled in my gut. It was the last place I wanted to be. And then, I sneezed. It was sudden, violent, and loud. My own body had betrayed me. From the darkness, I heard the creature snort, a deep, throaty rumble. Then the sound of claws scraping against the floor, charging, straight toward me. I had no choice. I yanked open the morgue door and slipped inside, slamming it shut behind me. The air was thick with the scent of dust and something else, something old, metallic. I recognized the room instantly. 3 stainless steel tables were evenly spaced in the center, each one positioned beneath a dish-shaped examination light hanging from the ceiling. The fixtures were coated in cobwebs, their long strands swaying slightly in the stale air. Cabinets lined the walls behind the tables, their countertops still cluttered with rusting medical tools. Scalpels, bone saws, rib spreaders, everything needed to carve open a body and figure out what had killed it. What I had never seen in any crime show morgue, no matter how many episodes I'd watched, was a collection of human skulls arranged like some kind of grotesque trophies. There were at least 6 of them, each carefully placed on the work tables as if they were on display. I had to blink hard, convincing myself my mind wasn't playing tricks on me. But the most unsettling part wasn't just the skulls themselves. It was the one in the center. A long, ancient-looking samurai sword had been rammed straight through its temple, the blade's ends bent upward in a way that almost resembled rabbit ears. A slow, sinking feeling crawled through my stomach. "Oh, this is bad," I muttered under my breath, my voice barely audible over the pounding in my ears. At the far end of the room, another door stood slightly ajar. Thick, heavy, and insulated, it led straight into what I instantly recognized as a walk-in freezer. My brain quickly did the math. A freezer meant a dead end. A dead end inside a dead end. The creature's footsteps were getting louder, the guttural sound of its breathing rolling through the room like distant thunder. My time was up, and I had nowhere else to go. I hesitated for half a second, then lunged for the open freezer door, slipping inside just as the thing came barreling into the morgue. The moment I stepped foot inside, a fresh wave of dread hit me like a truck. I had just jumped straight out of the frying pan and into the fire. Against the farthest wall, across from a long row of storage drawers meant for holding the dead, was a massive pile of torn-up fabric, shredded foam, and what looked like chunks of old bedding. The pile was huge, easily taller than I was, made up of what had to be every single mattress left in this abandoned hospital. The material had been dragged here, ripped apart, and arranged into something with a familiar shape. Something I realized with a sickening certainty was designed for the creature to curl up inside. It wasn't just a pile. This was its den, its lair, its nest. I had trapped myself inside the monster's bedroom. My pulse hammered so violently I felt dizzy, the blood roaring in my ears making it impossible to think straight. There was no need to check for a pulse. I could feel it thrumming inside me, loud and fast, like my body was screaming at me to move. I threw a desperate glance toward the freezer door, but the reality of my situation hit me hard. There was no lock. Worse, the door swung outward, meaning I couldn't even barricade it from the inside. Panic clawed up my throat. I grabbed at the handles of the body drawers, frantically yanking on one, then another, but none of them budged. I didn't know if they were rusted shut or if some kind of latch was keeping them locked, and I didn't have time to figure it out. My breath came in quick, ragged gasps as I turned in a full circle, sweeping my flashlight around the room. Nothing. No counters to crouch behind, no thick curtains to disappear into, no laundry chutes to dive down. I was completely exposed. I don't remember the exact moment the idea came to me. I don't even recall thinking it through. 1 second, I was standing there, my back pressed to the cold metal of a storage unit, my mind racing. The next, I was moving. I dove straight into the mound of shredded mattress stuffing, burrowing in as deep as I could, shoving myself back deeper, until the only thing surrounding me was layers of thick, musty fabric and the overwhelming stench of something rotten. My gag reflex hit immediately, my throat tightening, my stomach twisting into knots. I clenched my teeth, willing myself not to retch, forcing every muscle in my body to stay still. Just as I clicked off my flashlight, the creature made its entrance. A low, rumbling growl filled the space, vibrating in my chest like the growl of something far too large to belong here. A sharp clack, clack, clack followed, the distinct sound of claws against tile. My lungs seized, my breath frozen in my throat as the thing paced back and forth, sniffing the air, exhaling slow, heavy breaths. Then, metal screamed. A high-pitched shriek of steel grinding against steel echoed through the room. It took me half a second to realize what it was doing. It was ripping open the body drawers. It was searching for me. One by one, I heard the thick doors being torn open, metal hinges groaning in protest. The creature's breathing grew more agitated with each empty compartment. It went on for what felt like forever, my entire body locked in place, my fingers curled so tightly into the fabric that my knuckles ached. And then, finally, the footsteps retreated. I barely allowed myself to exhale. Even buried beneath the stuffing, I could still hear the thing rummaging around outside, throwing things aside with sharp, frustrated grunts. A cabinet door slammed. A table scraped against the floor. The low, guttural noise it made sent chills creeping up my spine. Then silence. I listened hard. Nothing moved for a long, tense moment. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it, a yawn. My stomach plummeted. A second later, I felt the shift. The mattress stuffing compressed around me, the weight of something massive settling into place. I clenched my jaw, every muscle in my body locking up, my lungs burning from how hard I was trying not to breathe. The thing fluffed the pile, shifting its weight, making a low, contented noise in the back of its throat. The fibers tickled my face, the stench of decay nearly making me choke, but I didn't move. I couldn't move. And then, to my absolute horror, the creature began to snore. The realization hit me like a freight train. I wasn't just hiding in its nest. I was trapped underneath it, the monster's bed. And for the first time that night, I almost laughed. I pressed my knuckles against my lips, still fighting that ridiculous urge to laugh. My pulse hammered in my ears. My muscles coiled tight beneath my skin, ready to either explode into motion or collapse under the weight of sheer exhaustion. Every nerve in my body screamed to act. fight, run, something. But I forced myself to move slow. Bit by bit, I clawed my way out from the suffocating mass of shredded mattress stuffing. Once I was free, I turned my head slightly, glancing back toward the monstrous shape slumped in the nest. It let out a low, rattling buzz as it slept. The room was pitch black, no windows, no slivers of moonlight to illuminate the thing I had barely escaped from. And there was no way in hell I was about to risk turning on my flashlight. So even now, after all that, I still hadn't gotten a good look at it. The most I had seen were the glimpses I caught while running for my life. On my hands and knees, I crept forward, sweeping my fingers across the cold floor ahead of me, feeling for anything that might trip me up. Slowly, carefully, I navigated my way out of the cold storage room, through the autopsy room, and into the basement corridor. Only when I had the morgue door securely shut behind me did I finally dare to turn my flashlight back on. The beam flickered, weak, struggling. The batteries were nearly dead, but they held on just long enough for me to find the central stairwell and scramble up to the main floor. By the time I reached the reception area, dawn had begun to creep through the grimy windows, casting long, golden streaks across the dusty floor. I barely slowed down as I jogged past the front desk and into the lobby, my only goal to get the hell out of that building. I shoved open the frosted glass doors and nearly ran straight into Stanley. He stood there, completely at ease, holding a cardboard tray with 2 styrofoam cups and a crumpled paper bag. With his free hand, he was lifting the security gate that blocked the entrance. His eyes flicked over me, taking in my disheveled state, the sweat-drenched clothes, the frantic wildness in my eyes. "Rough night, huh?" he quipped, his tone casual, too casual. Then his gaze dropped to my feet. "What happened to your shoe?" I barely registered his words before I swung my heavy maglite straight at his head. Stanley moved fast. He deflected the blow like he had been expecting it. "I brought coffee," he said, lifting the tray slightly, as if that somehow explained everything. I swung again. He blocked again, but this time he snatched the flashlight out of my grasp with effortless precision, twisting it from my fingers and tucking it into his back pocket like it was nothing. "Would you quit that?" he muttered, adjusting his grip on the coffee tray. "You're gonna make me spill it." I snapped. A raw, furious scream tore out of my throat, an incoherent string of curses and accusations. My voice bounced off the empty walls behind me, ringing through the abandoned hospital like a siren. Then I realized how loud I was being. My breath hitched. I bolted past Stanley, nearly stumbling in my rush to get as far away from that place as possible. I only stopped once I was halfway down the front steps. Behind me, Stanley casually pulled down the security gate and locked it. "Don't worry," he said, completely unfazed. "It's asleep by now." I gaped at him, still panting. Sometimes it doesn't come out of its nest for days, even weeks. He leaned back against the gate, eyeing me with something almost like amusement. "But you got your cherry busted on your first night and survived. That's impressive." He nodded, as if genuinely pleased. "Had a good feeling about you." I stared at him, barely able to process what I was hearing. "What the hell, dude?" I gasped. "You knew about the monster?" Stanley shrugged, unfazed. "Well, yeah, that's kind of my job, finding people to keep it occupied." I felt my stomach turn. My fingers curled into fists. "You mean to feed it?" Stanley sighed, then slowly limped his way down the steps until he was standing beside me. He held out one of the coffees. I didn't take it. Instead, I just stood there, trying to process the sheer insanity of what he had just admitted. After a moment, he sank down onto the steps and motioned for me to do the same. Against all reason, I did. "There's cream and sugar if you want it," he said, reaching into the paper bag and pulling out a donut. They only had glazed. I didn't respond. I was still trying to wrap my head around the fact that I had almost died in that place, had nearly become another piece of whatever sick game Stanley was playing. And he was just sitting here, offering me breakfast. But I was shaking, my body still wrecked from adrenaline and exhaustion, and before I could stop myself, I reached for the coffee. Stanley didn't say anything as I opened a handful of sugar packets and dumped them into the cup. 4 creams. 6 sugars. My hands trembled as I stirred. I wasn't even a coffee drinker. Stanley watched with raised eyebrows, but said nothing. "What?" I snapped. He smirked. "Nothing. Take as much as you want." He lifted his own cup. "I drink mine black." I took a hesitant sip. The first taste was awful. The second was surprisingly good. Without thinking, I reached into the bag and grabbed a donut, stuffing half of it into my mouth. Stanley took another sip of his coffee, his face contorting in mild disgust at the bitterness. "It's not about feeding it, really. More like keeping it entertained," he said, shifting slightly on the steps. I raised an eyebrow. "Entertained?" He nodded. "Yeah, I mean, sure, every once in a while someone gets unlucky, but we do our best to prevent that. The real goal is to keep it occupied. Someone has to be in there every single night, just in case it wakes up. If it doesn't have someone to chase, it gets restless. And trust me, you don't want it getting restless." A cold chill ran through me. What happens if it gets out? Stanley exhaled sharply, staring off at the horizon. Nothing good. I waited for him to elaborate, but he didn't. Instead, he continued, "We've got a crew for this. We call it running the halls. Russo was one of our regulars, but she had an unfortunate accident, which left an open spot on the schedule. I had to fill it last minute." I frowned. "By unfortunate accident, do you mean? She got eaten?" Stanley finished for me. "No. She got hit by a car, broke her pelvis." I stared at him, stunned. "So, you just grabbed the first idiot who walked through the door looking for a job?" Stanley chuckled. "Nope. There were 3 other applicants. I picked you." I blinked. "Why me?" He shrugged. "Seemed like you had the best chance of survival. And if things didn't work out, well, you'd be the least likely to be missed." Anger bubbled up in my chest. "Hey, I got parents, I got roommates. People would notice if I disappeared." "Yeah, sure," he said, smirking. "But would they miss you?" That shut me up. I folded my arms. "You could have at least been more honest in the job listing." Stanley snorted, nearly choking on his coffee. "Oh, yeah, that would go over real well." He lifted his hands as if framing an imaginary newspaper ad. "Help wanted, monster bait, competitive pay, benefits, no experience necessary." I let out a dry laugh and grabbed another donut. "I mean, you got a point." After swallowing a mouthful of sugar and dough, I asked, "So what actually happens if it gets out?" Stanley's expression darkened. "You ever hear of the Mill Street Massacre?" The name stirred something in my memory, an old news story from when I was in middle school. Maybe freshman year. The details were hazy. "That was the drug cartel thing, right?" I asked. "Some kind of gang war? People got hacked up with machetes?" "That's what the newspapers said," Stanley murmured. "But it wasn't a cartel, and it wasn't machetes." I felt a pit form in my stomach. I shifted uncomfortably. "If this thing is that dangerous, why doesn't someone just kill it?" Stanley gave a humorless chuckle. "People have tried. Guns, fire, electrocution, crossbow bolts dipped in holy water. You name it, never works." My throat went dry. "No one's even come close?" "The last guy who tried was named Dwayne," Stanley said, shaking his head. "He'd been running the halls for 6 months. One night, he decided he'd had enough, showed up with a damn samurai sword." I blinked. "A samurai sword?" Stanley smirked. "Yeah. Can you believe that? I tried to talk him out of it, but he wouldn't listen. Walked in with that sword and never walked out." A shiver ran through me. "They found anything?" "Usually when it gets someone, we find bits and pieces in the morning," Stanley said. "Not with Dwayne. Nothing. I always wondered what happened to him." I opened my mouth to tell him about the skull I'd seen in the autopsy room, but something held me back. Instead, I reached for another donut, my third. Stanley took another sip of coffee and stared off into the distance. "Nobody knows how to kill it. Hell, we don't even know what it is." I swallowed hard. "Then, what do you think it is?" He was quiet for a moment before answering. "Some say it's a demon. Others think it's some kind of genetic mutation." His fingers drummed lightly against his cup. "Me? I think it's the physical manifestation of negative energy." I frowned. "What does that even mean?" Stanley shrugged. "It's the only explanation that makes sense to me. But I can't say it's any better than the others." I chewed on my donut, feeling my stomach tighten. "All I do know," Stanley said, his voice low, "is that it's been around for at least 150 years. The earliest accounts date back to just after the Civil War. That's how long this thing has been around. And if there's one thing we've learned in all that time, it's that destroying its nest is a terrible idea. It doesn't die, it just relocates. And every time it does, a whole lot of people end up dead before we manage to track it down again and figure out how to keep it contained. So why don't you just Stanley cut me off with a raised hand and a shake of his head. Kid, trust me. We've been doing this a long time. Longer than I've been around, and I've been around for a while. His expression was tired, but there was an edge to it, like he was already exhausted by the conversation we were having. Whatever brilliant idea you're about to throw out, it's already been tried. And it didn't work. We do things this way because it's the only way that does. He took another sip of his coffee, grimaced, then continued. The job pays $2,000 a week, full benefits. We match contributions to your 401k. You'll be on the schedule 2, maybe 3 nights a week. I don't like putting people in back-to-back shifts, so I won't need you again until Thursday. I stared at him. Are you insane? No way in hell I'm going back in there. If you need someone to play hide and seek with that thing, find somebody else. Or better yet, do it yourself. Stanley smirked. Too scared? I let out a bitter laugh. Damn right, I'm scared. He reached down, rolling up the cuff of his chinos to reveal the smooth, metallic gleam of a prosthetic leg. I ran those halls for 8 years, he said. One night, things went sideways. I swallowed hard. Shit, sorry. Stanley shrugged, like it didn't bother him. Company promoted me to supervisor after that. We try to take care of our people. Sure, it's not as exciting, doesn't pay as much, and yeah, sometimes I have to send folks to their deaths. He exhaled slowly. That part sucks, but somebody's got to do it. A heavy silence settled between us. I chewed another bite of my donut, suddenly not tasting the sugar anymore, while Stanley nursed his coffee, making a face every time he took a sip. I was starting to suspect that he didn't actually drink his coffee black, just kept up the illusion for appearances. After a few minutes, he checked his watch, then stood up, limping slightly as he descended the steps. Well, I gotta head to the office. Paperwork, you know how it is. He turned back toward me, adjusting his jacket. See you Thursday night, 10:45. Don't be late. I shook my head in disbelief. Dude, I am not coming within 10 miles of this place ever again. Stanley just chuckled. You'll be here, he said, his voice tinged with amusement. I got a feeling about you. I frowned. What feeling? He looked me dead in the eye. You liked it. I felt my stomach drop. That's ridiculous. But Stanley's smirk deepened. First time in years you felt really, truly alive. His gaze didn't waver. Tell me I'm wrong. I wanted to. God help me, I wanted to. But I couldn't. Stanley saw the answer in my silence. He grinned, clapping me once on the shoulder. Welcome to the crew. See you Thursday. Then he hauled himself into his truck and drove off, leaving behind a trail of blue-tinged exhaust. I haven't stopped thinking about it these last 2 days. Maybe I'm an adrenaline junkie and never knew it. Maybe I'm one of those people who thrives on fear, the kind that makes your heart race and your breath hitch. Or maybe, for the first time in my adult life, I actually have a sense of purpose. I don't know. And honestly, I don't care. I've barely touched my phone. I've been spending more time outside my apartment, and I don't feel the need to check my pulse every 10 minutes just to make sure I'm still here. Seems like I finally found that guiding force my mom always talked about. Turns out, it's a 12-foot monstrosity that shoves samurai swords through people's skulls. It's 10:15 on Thursday night. I'm standing outside my building, waiting for my Uber to take me to St. Luke's as I type this. I guess Stanley's feeling about me was right after all. Wish me luck.